The central bank lowered the reserve requirement. What happens to the money multiplier and the money supply? Well, we've seen that to calculate the money multiplier would be 1 over the reserve ratio. And then you could also say, if you want to include the cash drain ratio or the currency deposit ratio, 1 over the reserve ratio plus the currency deposit or the cash drain ratio. If the central bank, if we disregard the currency deposit ratio for a second, it's 1 over the reserve ratio. So if the central bank lowered the reserve requirement, what would happen to this money multiplier and the money supply? Well, if you lower the reserve requirement, two things can happen. If the banks still decide to keep the same amount of reserves as before, nothing happens. But none of these answers here say that nothing happens. So that option actually is not represented here. But if we think that since they've lowered the reserve requirement, banks, commercial banks would keep less reserves, well, with less reserves or a smaller reserve ratio, as we've seen in class, like 1 over 0.10 over compared to 1 over 0.05, which is 10% versus 5%. Well, 1 over 0.05 will have a multiplying factor of 20 times compared to 10 times for 10%. Therefore, money multiplier will increase, and as the money multiplier increases, it multiplies all the amount of actual currency in the economy and lead to a greater money supply. So the money multiplier and the money supply would both increase. During recessions, banks typically choose to hold more excess reserves relative to their deposits so that they don't go bankrupt. Which statement best describes the effect of the increase in reserves? Well, as they keep more reserves, it's the opposite of the previous question. The money multiplier decreases, so it's pretty straightforward, and the money supply also decreases. Who owns the Bank of Canada? This is a very simple question, but I want it to be clear. Commercial banks are owned by various individuals. And you could own stock in a commercial bank and so on. Who owns central banks like the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, and the European Central Bank? Well, those things are not owned by individuals. They're typically owned by the government of that country or a mix of countries for the European Central Bank. So it's not the Queen, it's not private individuals, it's not the charter banks. It is the federal government of Canada who owns the Bank of Canada. What is current Canadian currency? So in this class, we've seen two different types of currency. In the past, we had what we call commodity money, which was using gold or different commodities to use as currency, and it had a certain level of intrinsic value. Fiat money, which is this paper bill that we say that has value, but if people weren't going to accept it anymore, a $20 bill does not have that much value. You might be able to light a very small fire with it or do something else, but it doesn't have $20 worth of value. So it's fiat money with no intrinsic value. Commodity money has intrinsic value, in the sense that if no one wants to accept that coin anymore, you could always melt it and create jewelry with it. So that's it. But the Canadian currency right now is fiat money with no intrinsic value. Suppose that the reserve ratio is 9% and then the bank has $2,000 in deposits. What are its required reserves? Well, 9% would be out of each $1,000 of deposit, or out of each $100 would be $9, out of each $1,000 would be $90, out of $2,000 would be $180, would be the minimum amount of required reserves. It could be more, but that is the absolute minimum required. So those were the questions for Chapter 10.